Let's talk about trusts and how smart investors use them to buy not just 2 or 3 properties, but 10, 15, or even 20 without hitting a wall with the banks. If you've ever spoken to your broker or a bank and they've told you, sorry, you've maxed out your borrowing, then this video is for you, because trusts are a powerful tool to preserve your affordability, meaning in theory you could have unlimited borrowing capacity, allowing you to scale your portfolio to 10, 15, 20, or even more. Of course, it's not all smooth sailing. This isn't a simple strategy. There are conditions, risks, and moving parts that you need to understand. So in this video, we'll break it all down step by step. How it works, and when it can backfire. So in theory, we could scale and build a sizable portfolio just like the top 1% of investors. And hopefully we can get all of these properties. And I want you to stay tuned for the end of the video because I have a very secret bonus tip that I'm going to reveal that allows you to bypass one of the biggest obstacles in this strategy. And this is something that literally no one talks about and no one's revealed, but I'm just going to give it out for free. All right, quick overview. What is a trust? A trust is essentially a legal structure used to hold and manage assets, like property, on behalf of others. It works like this. At the very top, you've got the trust deed, which is essentially a trust rule book that lays out everything the trust must do, and it must follow this trust deed. It lays out who the beneficiaries are, how decisions are made, and what the trustee can or can't do. Within the actual structure, at the top, you've got the corporate trustee, which is typical for property investment. It doesn't have to be a corporate trustee, but if you're doing this for property investing, typically you'll set up a discretionary trust with a corporate trustee, which will have a company as your trustee. This is something you'll work closely with your accountant to set up. Now, this corporate trustee or trustee will be acting as trustee for the family trust. At the bottom, you have the beneficiaries. These are the people who benefit from the trust. And that might be your spouse, your kids, or other family members. You can think of this whole thing as a container. The trustee controls what goes in and out, but the benefits, such as rental income or capital growth, they're passed on to the beneficiaries. Beneficiaries have a right to receive the benefits from the trust, either based on the trust deed or through the trustee's discretionary decisions. For example, the right to benefit from income generated by the assets held by the trust. When it comes to property investing, there's 2 main types of trusts that we care about, as discretionary or family trusts, and they're common because they allow you to distribute income in a flexible way. For example, directing rental profits to whoever is in your family on the lowest tax rate. And this is something we'll discuss later. There's also unit trusts, which are a bit less common, but still used for property. Typically, they're ideal for joint ventures, where ownership is fixed. For example, 60% to one person and 40% to another. So profit and control, they're split based on the number of units that each person holds. Okay. Now, the reason that some banks are willing to exclude debt held in a trust, if it's structured with a corporate trustee, comes down to one key concept: a separate legal entity. Okay, an SLE for short. So a separate legal entity is a structure that the law recognizes as having its own identity, separate from the people who own or control it. In simple terms, it's treated like its own person under the law, even though it's not a real human. Now, here's the nuance. A trust itself is not a separate legal entity, okay? It doesn't technically exist on its own, but a company is a separate legal entity. And that's why, to create a structure that the banks view as legally separate from you, the trustee of the trust must be a company that you control, which is why we have that corporate trustee in place. With this structuring, a trust with a corporate trustee, lenders can treat it entirely as a separate entity from your personal finances. And as a result, they may exclude this debt from your borrowing capacity calculation, because legally you don't own the property and the trust does, and the trust is not you. I'm no accountant, so confirm this and have a chat with your accountant who's comfortable and knowledgeable in this area for property investing and trusts. However, trusts typically are not separate legal entities despite being treated as separate legal entities for tax purposes, whereas companies, they are separate legal entities. So when you have that join by having that corporate trustee within the family trust as well, together you have a separate legal entity. Now, banks won't just exclude debt because it's held in a trust. The trust must be trading profitably. This is one of the caveats of this strategy. This means that the rental income typically has to cover all the expenses, including the mortgage and interest repayments. Once the trust is profitable, then you'll need to obtain a letter from your accountant. And this letter will confirm that the trust is trading sufficiently and it's able to meet its financial obligations. So your accountant will look at your trust financials. If it's trading profitably, they'll provide a letter stating it's self-sufficient. Then you'll grab this letter, pass it on to your mortgage broker, and they'll submit it to the bank with your application. And only then can that debt be excluded from your servicing assessment. Now, earlier I did mention that bonus tip that I will go through in the end. This is a typical process where you need this self-sufficiency requirement. But stay tuned for the end of the video where I'll go through a way around this loophole, which not many people know about. And I will say it is a highly risky strategy, but if you're capable to do it, it's possible. So we'll talk about that later. Okay, so over here, I've got an example naming convention for both the trust and the company, as well as what you put on the contract of sale when you sign a contract for a property. So let's take Mr. John Smith, for example. He's got the company. He's named it Smith Investments Number 1, Pty Ltd. And he's got his trust, Smith Family Trust Number 1. He's using number 1 so he can make it nice and clear when he's got 510 trusts with 510 properties. So that's the convention. You can name it anything you want. Now, on the contract of sale, what you put in for the name on the contract, it won't be your personal name. It'll be your company and your trust together, right? So typically it's the company corporate trustee as trustee for your family trust. Mr. Smith would put Smith Investments Number 1, Pty Ltd as trustee for Smith Family Trust Number 1. You should check this with your conveyancer. Just confirm the correct wording and it should be all good to go. Okay. Advantages and disadvantages of purchasing in a trust. Advantages. Preserving your borrowing capacity. Properly structured trusts can allow you to exclude the debt and income from your personal serviceability, helping you build a larger portfolio without hitting serviceability limits. There's also flexible tax distribution, so you can distribute profits to lower income family members, such as your spouse, an adult child, and this can reduce your overall tax bill. Also, land tax minimization on larger portfolios. Individual trusts can each access separate land tax thresholds, making them more efficient for spreading land value across multiple entities. We'll go through this in detail later. Land tax is typically still higher in trusts, but there's ways to optimize it, especially when you're buying in different states. There's asset protection, so typically property held in trust is generally shielded from personal legal action or bankruptcy, which can be useful for business owners or professionals in high-risk industries. You should check this with a tax solicitor though, because with property investment, you still act as a guarantor to service the loan. So it's not always the case that this asset protection applies. You have to speak to a tax solicitor to confirm that. But for trusts, typically there is that asset protection and limited liability due to the entity being a separate legal entity. We'll touch on this later. There's also strategic estate planning, smoother transfer of control and of income streams to beneficiaries over time without triggering capital gains events, which is the main benefit. There's also greater long-term cost efficiency. So while upfront and ongoing costs exist, on average about $2,000 to set up the trust and $1,000 to $2,000 to maintain per year, depending on your accountant, the scalability of trusts and the associated tax benefits generally outweigh the long-term costs when compared to holding properties in your personal name. Disadvantages of purchasing in a trust. The initial setup costs, expect around $2,000 to $2.5K for each trust with a corporate trustee. You've got the annual running costs as well, which can sit between $1 to $2K per trust per year. And the learning curve and complexity. Navigating trust structures requires a lot more admin legal oversight and more sophisticated tax and finance planning. There's more to learn about it, but hopefully this video will help you. There's also reduced lender options. Not all lenders will allow trusts to be excluded from serviceability. And the finance approval process is a lot more complex than a standard personal buy. There's a lot more documents to sign. Physical signing of certain documents takes a longer time. There's also no immediate negative gearing benefit. So losses inside the trust, they can't be offset against your personal pay-to income. They're carried forward and only usable against future trust profits. There's also higher land tax on 1 to 2 properties in most states. Equity access might be slower. Refinancing from a trust is possible, but there are extra steps involved, including the requirement for accountant letters, and often there is higher lender scrutiny. You also can't backdate events, so you can't shift a property into a trust after you've bought it personally without triggering CGT and stamp duty. So your structuring is really important to be done before your purchase. And that's why it's really important to do planning over your long term from day zero. Because if you make a mistake and you buy in your wrong entity based on your goals, you might regret it later. And backdating and trying to move a personal purchase into a trust might end up costing you more. Buying in our personal name. How do the banks actually calculate our affordability? Now, this touches on broking a little bit, so confirm this all with your mortgage broker. But this is typically what happens with banks in how they assess our affordability. So what I'm going to try and explain here is that even though you might be positive on paper, you might be negative on application. So what does this mean? If we're buying in our personal name, what's actually happening, we're receiving $850 per week. So we've got an investment of $700K, which runs at $850 per week. Over the year, we get $44.2K. Our loan amount is $560K at 6.2% interest only. Repayments are about $34K per year. Other rental expenses will take $7K per year. So net cash flow, we're positive $2.4K per year. Even though we're actually cash flow positive, how the banks calculate affordability is different. They need to have safety buffers in place, which is why even though on paper we're positive, they will actually assess us as negative. The reason is they only accept 80% of the rent. So our $44.2K becomes $35,360 per year. They also buffer the loan repayments. So here we're interest only at 6.2%, but they're going to account for principal and interest at a 3% high interest rate of 9.2, which means they're estimating outgoings of $57K per year. We'll take the same rental expenses, but our assessed position is now negative $29,000 essentially per year, which is a difference of $26K, even though we're positively cash flow here. So even though the banks might assess you as earning $30,000 less in annual income, even if the property actually puts money in your pocket. So this will have a hit on your borrowing power every time you purchase because they're assessing it as negative. So your affordability reduces for subsequent purchases. Okay, how can trusts unlock your borrowing power then? Are we still positive on paper and negative on application, or is there a way around this? Same example as before in the personal name. Even though we're positive 2.4K, the banks don't view this, so they're going to take negative 30K, which reduces our affordability over time. But if we use a trust, the trust income and expenses are going to be treated as $0 because this will be excluded from our servicing calculation. The reason being is the accountant's letter that we talked about earlier. So our accountant will provide the letter that confirms that this trust is trading profitably and it's self-sufficient. The wording does differ between banks, but the banks will ignore both the debt and the income, and the net impact on our borrowing capacity is actually zero, which is excellent. So this lets us essentially keep scaling our portfolio while having a minimal hit on our borrowing capacity. The quick tip is to use one trust per property and keep each one profitable. This keeps your serviceability clean and scalable. Okay, now let's take a look at an actual example of implementing this trust strategy. We're taking a single individual with a borrowing capacity of $800,000. So we've got pathway 1 over here, which is the typical traditional method, personal name investing only. So property number 1, personal name investment of $300K. 800,000 is the original. Now they're left at 500K borrowing. Maybe they can get property 2 and they buy a 400K property. Now they've got 100K left. They can't afford any further property because there's not enough affordability left. So they've been capped at 2. And yes, you might argue, okay, they can increase their income to increase their borrowing capacity, or interest rates will come down. And those are all fair. But how long can that go on? An average person, how much can they really accelerate their income to increase their borrowing? If this person's on 100K per annum, maybe a couple of years they can get to 150, even 200, 250. Maybe they can squeeze in another property, number 3. If they're lucky, maybe number 4. But at a point, you're going to get capped out, right? So you could do it, but it's pretty unrealistic for our average individual. And if you intend to really scale and build a sizable portfolio, you need something else, right? That's when we go to pathway 2 and we leverage trusts. So same scenario. We start with 800,000 borrowing. And yeah, maybe we'll still buy this personally. It's our first property, 300K, done. We've got 500K left. Now we leverage trusts. We get that accountant's letter that we spoke about, and we buy a 400K property here. Now we go to number 3, and wow, look at that. We still got 500K left because of this letter. Open a new trust, buy another house, 470K. Another accountant's letter, repeat. Property number 4, 420K. Still got 500K borrowing the whole time. Keep going to property number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. As many as you can hold, as many as you want to hold, so long as your cash flow can be managed by what you're earning in your payee. So obviously there's expenses for holding all these, 2K per trust, and then obviously your property costs as well. So as long as you can manage that cash flow, you can keep scaling in theory, as long as they're profitable and they're self-sufficient and you're getting these accountants letters. So this is a way how you can actually use trusts to scale your portfolio and not hit a serviceability wall. We've got a single individual with 800K borrowing power. They've got one personal name investment of 300K and the affordability within trusts are 500K. So they've kept that and they've got up to 15 with 14 of them being in trusts, different price points. And these are all trading profitably, which is fine. And it's likely that they're all interest only for 5 years, because if you go interest only, your repayments are lower, meaning that your trust and your property can enter positive cash flow realm a lot quicker. Let's say in 5 years' time, what if this ticks over to P&I? Let's say you forgot to refinance this property at the end of 5 years back to interest only and it takes to P&I, or you're unable to refinance that and it goes to P&I. If that's a risk, P&I repayments are higher, then this does not trade profitably anymore, it's negative. And since it's the one, you might be able to refinance it back to interest only, but if you're not, because this is now negative, now for everything else, this trust is being included into your serviceability calculations. Let's say you bought number 3 a few months after this, and then this one ticks back to P&I as well, because you're unable to refinance due to the fact that now this negative trust is being included in your serviceability calculations. Now you're stuck because this is now in P&I, your repayment's higher, this is now negative. And then it's a domino effect. You're unable to refinance any of those, and they all eventually start ticking back to P&I because you're unable to refinance back to interest only. And that means your cash flow gets crumbled. This is a risk that you need to consider, and you need to do planning. What's your own risk reward analysis in this strategy? Now, let's say that once these go to P&I, they're costing you about 10K negative per annum. You're in a high income, spending about 150K for an example, and you're able to write out some of this debt and start paying it off. You're able to get in a better position. But let's say 10 of your trusts go to P&I and the negative 10K. That's 15 times 10, 150K. You're not able to manage that cash flow. You do get stuck, and there is a big risk here that you need to consider. You need to plan from day one how you're going to do this, what's going to happen, do a risk reward analysis, worst case scenario, what's going to happen, and how you're going to get out of it. It is a riskier strategy with trust that you do need to consider. Another thing to note is that these are the current bank policies at the time of recording, and all of these, if they're profitable, they can be excluded from serviceability calculations, but policies could change in the future. We don't know what's going to happen. One day they decide, okay, we're going to include trusts in our calculation. And then a similar thing will happen when you're unable to keep going, or you're unable to refinance back to interest only once they take over the P&I. What I would do to manage this risk a little bit is I would keep a buffer and have a high equity position. So I'd go ideally at least 80% LVR, so that we have enough equity in each property. And as they grow, ideally we want to get to a position where it's 70% LVR. So that way you have 30% equity. And worst case, if these take over to P&I, we can sell the first 1 or 2 off, and we'll have a significant equity position that we can use that money to help maintain the shortfall in cash flow to get us into a better position. It's important to consider, and maybe having that lower LVR, 80%, 70%, keeps a cash buffer in place. So that worst case, when you sell, you can have some cash to manage this cash flow. Another risk could be if your property prices actually decrease in value. That'll put you in a bad position as well. That's why it's important with asset selection as well. First of all, you need something that's positively geared. Second of all, you want something that's in a high growth location, so the risk of it dropping in price is minimal or none. It's also important to consider where you're actually investing, because if you invest in a location where it's not high growth, or you're unconfident and you're unsure and this property might decrease in value, that'll put you in a bad position. Having that assurance of knowing that your asset itself will perform well and it won't have decreased growth in the future really gives a lot more confidence in this strategy. And I really wouldn't recommend doing this trust investment due to these risks if you're unsure where you're investing and you're not sure how the performance of that property will be in the next few years. And that's why it's super important to actually know how to invest and where to invest in places where it will outperform the Australian average, so you have the assurance that your asset itself will perform well. That might be taking the time to learn and educate yourself and actually how to identify these locations that are high growth, or you can lean on someone, a buyer's agent who's experienced and knows how to do these things professionally, if that's something that you need to consider. I've got a lot of free content on my channel and Insta page showing how to identify high growth locations, how to do thorough due diligence, the buyer's agent does. So if you are able to do this stuff yourself and learn it, feel free. But sometimes a lot of us are time poor, we don't have the time and we want to outsource this work to a buyer's agent. Either one's fair enough. If you want to talk about learning how to do it yourself or potentially using a buyer's agent, feel free to send me a message on Instagram and we can have a chat. All right, let's talk about land tax. One of the hidden costs that can really add up if you're not careful. Every state in Australia charges land tax on investment properties. The only major exception is your principal place of residence, which is exempt. Now here's where it gets tricky. Each state has its own land tax thresholds, and those thresholds are different depending on whether you own the property in your personal name or through a trust. For example, in Victoria, if you hold property in your personal name, you don't pay land tax on the first $50,000 of land value. But if the property is in a trust, then that threshold drops to just $25,000, which means that land tax kicks in much sooner. On the flip side, Queensland and WA are a bit more trust friendly, at least for properties with lower land values. In Queensland, the land tax threshold is $600,000 for individuals and $350,000 for trusts. So trusts do get some breathing room, but once you go over that limit, the land tax can ramp up pretty quickly. That's why it's super important to think strategically about where you're buying and how you're structuring each purchase, because the wrong setup can cost you thousands in tax every year. Some states are much less trust friendly. For example, South Australia, it's got a land tax threshold of $668,000 for individuals, but $0 for trusts. That's right, $0. So you start paying land tax from the very first dollar of land value. So yes, using trust can cost you more in land tax. In my own experience, it's usually around $2,000 or more per year per property compared to holding it in your personal name. But here's the thing that you need to consider. That extra cost can often be worth it, especially if it helps you hold more property and build more wealth. I'll go through some examples now. One thing to make note of, these figures are land value, not the property value. So on average, land value is about 50% of the property value. So these examples were saying 300K, but you can consider them as 600K properties. So for 5 Queensland properties, 300K each in your personal name, it's about $16,875 in land tax. However, if we buy these in 5 different trusts, each one property in a separate trust, same property with land value of 300K, since we can access that threshold and trusts are assessed individually in terms of land tax, then we pay $0 land tax on each trust. So actually making a saving in that land tax. However, if we do account for that trust accounting fee, on average $2,000 per year, you can maybe get a bit less or a bit higher, depends on the accountant. We will estimate a total cost of $10,000. Now this is actually less than that $16,875 here. So this is an example how it can actually be favorable, but it's not all sunshines and rainbows. So if we go down and take a look, this is a Victorian example where it might not be as beneficial. And look, land tax will always end up costing more typically. However, as long as you can manage that cash flow, it really isn't a big deal. The reason for this is because our main goal here is to preserve our borrowing power. And if using trust lets us hold even one more property than we otherwise could have in our personal name, the capital growth on that one property will always outweigh these extra holding costs. So let's take an example. Let's say we're holding a property in a trust and it costs us an extra $4,000 or so holding it than it would otherwise have costed us if we did not hold it in a trust and it was a personal purchase. And let's say that property was bought for $500K. If that grows to $550K in 1 year, you made capital gain of $50K. And if you take away that extra $4,000 of cost, you're still in a better position by $46K. So what I'm trying to say is don't get too caught up with land tax. Do some planning to minimize it in trusts. But look, if you're the type of person to get too obsessed over these short-term holding costs and you can't see the bigger picture, then the strategy isn't really for you. Let's go back to this example in Victoria where there's typically a higher land tax. So we've got 5 properties here with land value 300K each in our personal name, and the total is $9,150 that we're paying our tax bill. All properties are in Victoria. Now, if we were to do the same thing as above and buy each one in a trust, in 5 different trusts, there's only a threshold of $25,000 in Victoria. So we still pay about $2.2K on each trust here. And then you add up the $2,000 accounting fees. Each trust is assessed individually, so we're paying $2,200 on average. Total land tax is about $11K, which in itself is higher than 9.1, about $2K as I estimated. Then you add in those trust accounting fees, about $21K that we can say. So you can see here, it's not always the fact that you're going to be able to reduce your land tax bill, but there are ways to optimize it, which we'll go through below. Okay, so how can we optimize land tax in trusts? So I've got a little rule book here that I follow pretty closely. Number 1, avoid buying more than one property in the same state within the same trust. Land tax can become extremely expensive, and I'll go through why below. Number 2, if you do plan to purchase multiple properties within the same trust, buying across different states can help minimize land tax. And that's because land tax is assessed per entity per state. So each trust is treated separately. All right, let's go through this example with option A and option B. Okay, in option A, I've got Trust A with 2 properties, one in Victoria, one in Queensland with a land value of $400K each. Trust B, 2 properties, the exact same thing. And the land tax bill for this trust from Victoria is $2.9K and from Queensland 2.3K. And identical in the second trust here, add those fees for trust accounting, it's about 7.2K each. Add that together, it's about 14K. And this is because these are treated separately. That's why we've got the same amount here. Now, example B, we do the reverse. I've got still 2 trusts, but let's say I decide to buy both Vic properties in the one trust and both Queensland in the second. Now, what happens here? We end up paying a lot more land tax. And the reason is trusts are treated separately, remember? But if we buy it in the same one, they're assessing land value of 800k here and 800k here. So in Victoria, 6.2k, Queensland 9.1k, adds up being 8.2 with the trust fee and 11k here, total of 19k, which is about 5k more. We don't want this. So because it's treated the same here, it's 800k that our land value is assessed on. Whereas if we go back to option A, land value that's assessed is actually 400k in Victoria overall for both, and 400k in Queensland overall for both, because we've split it up and each trust is assessed separately. So that's why if you're planning to do multiple properties in the same trust, don't have the same state for more than one property within each trust. Otherwise, you're going to end up paying quite a bit more. And hopefully this all makes sense. So if you need to pause this and go back to really make sure that this all clicks. But this is how you can optimize your land tax if you are buying in trusts. Overall, you're going to end up paying more land tax in trust than you were if you bought personally. But don't forget the bigger picture. We're here to preserve our borrowing power. If you've got the cash flow to do this, then you should do it. Distributing profits to reduce our tax liability. How are we going to do this? Let's have an example here. The assumptions are the wife is earning 150k per annum on their paying. Husband's earning 50k. Adult child is currently earning nothing. On the left-hand side, we've got a personal name purchase. Wife and husband, they bought a property valued at $2 million. They're making 100k from this. So let's say this financial year, they've taken home 100k. Now, the profit is distributed per the title ownership, which is 50-50, because it's a personal name purchase. Wife gets 50%, husband 50%. So, naturally, 50k each, wife's taxable income increases from 150k to 200k, and the husband's taxable income increases from 50k to 100k. The husband, their tax liability increases by 15k, and the wife's increases by 19.3. So the net profit from this 100k is 65,700. Let's go to this side. Now it's a trust purchase, and the wife and husband, they control the trust. Same property details, value 2 million, same profit 100k. Now the profit is distributed to the beneficiaries at the discretion of the trustee. What this means is they can decide how the profits are split up and distributed. Wife is the highest income earner, so naturally you'd want to give them the least amount of profit here. So we'll give them nothing. No change to their individual taxable income. Husband will take 25%. Their taxable income increases from 50 to 75k. Tax liability increases by 7.5k. The adult child, their taxable income increases from 0 now to 75, taking the bulk of this, increasing their tax liability to about 13.2k. And the total net profit now is 79,000 compared to 65,000 here. This is a tax saving of 13.5k, which they've gotten by having that ability through trusts to distribute the profits. Now, the ATO is cracking down a bit, so you have to be careful. When you distribute to a beneficiary, the money has to be used for their benefit. You can't just give it to the adult child and then have them transfer you that money back. So it has to be used for their benefit. So this can still be helpful if you want to fast track some savings for your adult child or their school money or even for a house deposit, whatever it is. If you want them to keep the money, it can be an effective strategy. Okay, how do we withdraw equity from a trust? We've got some assumptions. Sam, 100k per annum payee income. Their borrowing power within a trust is $800,000. So we've got Trust A, Trust B here. Trust A's got one property. The value is 800k, loan amount 550k. Trust B with two properties, loan amount 400k, and another one with a loan amount of 370k. So both comfortably within the 800k affordability. Over here, Sam's current loan is 550k, which means he has up to 250k in remaining borrowing capacity within Trust A, assuming an 80% LVR. Now this sets the maximum equity we can access from this trust at 250,000, because it actually depends on how much the property has appreciated. And in this case, the property has increased the value by 150,000, bringing the total value to 800,000, which is the maximum. So in this example, he can only pull out $90,000 of equity because you can typically, it's 80% that you can pull out. So 80% of 800,000, which is the value of the property, minus your loan amount, $90,000 of equity. And if the property continues to grow, assuming Sam's borrowing power remains constant at $800,000, he could gradually access up to the full $250,000 in equity over time. So in this example, it's pretty safe. Over time, you can access up to $250K, and it's likely that income will increase and affordability will increase, meaning you can access more. But the key consideration for affordability purposes is that he's got $800K affordability, but you need to leave room within the trust itself to be able to extract equity. If his loan amount was $800K and his affordability is $800K, even if that property is grown to like 3-5 million, whatever, crazy number, you can't extract any equity out because you don't have any affordability left within that trust. Over here, another example, he's got two properties, one with a loan amount of $400K, another with $370K. So the total loan amount is $770K. Whereas over here, total loan amount was $550K and he had some room to extract some equity. Now here, regardless of how much these properties increase in value, Sam can only extract $30,000 of equity because he's only got $800,000 of affordability, meaning he can only extract up to $30K, which is not ideal. If your properties are growing in value, you want to be able to extract that equity and use that to fast track your deposit for the next property. That's why typically, unless you have a very high borrowing power, it's probably better to do one property per trust rather than trying to squeeze in two. The benefit of having two properties within one trust when you can is obviously you save on that yearly trust accounting fee of about $2,000. That's a saving, but you need to consider your borrowing, because if you are very tight on borrowing by fitting in two properties, you're not going to be able to extract that equity, which is a drawback, which is why for the average individual doing this, it's probably better to just do one trust per property, even though you have to have that extra accounting fee. In the bigger picture, grand scheme of things, it's worth it. Like, these short-term holding costs are not that big of a deal. So yeah, as you can see, for affordability purposes, a trust must be assessed as a whole, so we can't pick and choose which properties to include or exclude, such as this example. So it has to be assessed as a whole. We can't pick and choose. And this is assessed together, $770K against $800,000, which is our maximum affordability. So if you can't hold multiple properties in one trust and your borrowing power is limited, it can restrict your ability to access equity from a single property. So it's really important to plan how you do this and really do some planning from property number one. How you're going to do it, how many properties in each trust, what's your borrowing power, is it going to increase? And in my personal opinion, if you're able to squeeze in two properties in one trust and have enough borrowing left to extract equity, I will try and buy one property in my personal name first, and then just go one house per trust going forward. That way you get that immediate negative gearing effect by having at least one property in your personal name. And we'll talk about negative gearing in trusts and how they work in trusts versus not in trusts and in your personal name. Hope that makes sense. If you need to, just rewind it and watch this part again. Negative gearing. It works a bit differently in trust compared to in your personal name. So typical negative gearing in your personal name, the losses from your property can be used to offset your PAYG taxable income in that financial year. It's an immediate tax benefit. So it's a common strategy for high income earners to reduce their taxable income. For example, if you're earning 100K per year and you are out of pocket 10K on your investment property in that year, typically you'd be taxed on 100K, but you can use that 10K to offset your PAYG income here. So you'll only be taxed on 90K. Now that's the typical negative gearing. However, in trusts, it works differently because you don't get immediate negative gearing benefit. Okay, so how it works is the losses are carried forward inside that trust. And you can't attach this to your PAYG income. So if you make that same 10K loss in year one, you can't offset it against your 100K income. So in year two, this loss gets carried forward. So there is still negative gearing within trusts. It's just not immediate. It's carried forward. What this means is in year 2, if we go positive, let's say 15K, in year 2, our property becomes positive, we can carry forward this 10K loss and apply it to year 2 and the gain of 15K. We will only pay tax on 5K now. We won't pay tax on the full 15K because we've used that carried forward loss from year 1 of 10K to offset this 15. So you still get that negative gearing benefit, but it's not immediate like the traditional sense in your personal name. It's carried forward within the trust losses, and they can still be used to reduce future profits. And my understanding is if you've got multiple trusts and one of them's positive, but another is negative, you can pull that loss into that positive trust and offset it that way so you can actually distribute these profits. Of course, speak to your accountant about this to confirm and get a better understanding, but this is typically how it works. Okay, the moment you've all been waiting for, the big reveal. What is the secret? How can we bypass the self-sufficiency requirement? That's right. How can we keep going, keep preserving and scaling our portfolio without needing these properties to be positively geared and without needing that accountant's self-sufficiency letter? Well, this is a big reveal. So, there are actually 3 lenders that allow trust debt to be excluded without requiring an accountant's letter. That's right. There are 3 lenders that only need your trust to be a trust, and you don't actually need this self-sufficiency letter, and the trust does not need to be trading profitably. It's my understanding that these banks really only care about the fact that the entity is a separate legal entity, and they don't consider the fact that it's not trading profitably. So what are these 3 banks? I'm not going to give away all 3, but one of them is Macquarie. If you are interested in discussing this strategy further, feel free to send me a message on Instagram or reach out, and I'm happy to support you into a mortgage broker that's comfortable using these 3 banks. If you do have your own broker, feel free to have a chat with them and see if they're aware of this. But yes, there are 3 banks that do not need that self-sufficiency requirement. However, it is important to know that if you do proceed on this route, it is very risky because you never know what will happen in the future. Bank policies might change. And also, if you're going to be negative cash flow, you really need to hone in on your cash flow position. Are you able to manage this shortfall in cash flow? Because you are going to be quite negatively geared on these properties. So you need to really do some budgeting and make sure you can hold these properties. Okay, so how can I get started? Step 1, talk to a mortgage broker. If you need a contact for a good mortgage broker, feel free to send me a message and I can introduce you. Same with the accountant. So step 2 would be talking to a good accountant who's going to help you decide on the right trust setup and make sure that it aligns with your tax situation and your long-term goals. With the mortgage broker, you got to be careful and make sure they understand how to structure loans for trusts and which lenders actually support that strategy. Number 3 would be setting up the trust and the corporate trustee. Once you've got the green light, your accountant can handle the paperwork, and this step will be critical, so don't rush it. After the trust is set up, your broker can arrange finance by getting your pre-approval through the trust. Next, you want to begin your property search. Now you're ready to look for the right deal, and ideally one that's positively geared or close to neutral. And if you want expert help sourcing the right property, that's where a buyer's agent can come in. Whether it's your first trust purchase or your 5th, having someone on your team who understands strategy, cash flow, and long-term scalability can make a massive difference. And if that's something you're exploring, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help out and see if we can be a fit for each other. Hopefully this video was informative. If you liked it, and if you need extra help or you want to talk further, feel free to send me a message on my Instagram or reach out below. Cheers.